Here is the paraphrased version of your script, with the word order slightly adjusted while keeping the original writing style, tone, and articulation intact. Welcome to the channel Stories of Slavery. Today's story uncovers a truth hidden for more than 200 years. She was bought for just one reason, to bear children who would later be sold, but what she did to her owner's bloodline was never meant to be found out. This is a heavy and disturbing story, so take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us the city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps ensure these stories are remembered, not erased. Let's begin. In the summer of 2019, a 67-year-old woman named Margaret Whitmore Collins sat in a private medical office in Boston, Massachusetts. Her life had been built on certainty. She came from one of the oldest families in the American South. Her ancestors had owned thousands of acres of land. They had built banks, railroads, and textile mills. For nearly 2 centuries, the Whitmore name had meant power, wealth, and legacy. But on that July afternoon, everything Margaret believed about her family was about to fall apart. The doctor placed a folder on the desk between them. He did not smile. He did not make small talk. He simply said the genetic results had come back and there was something he needed to explain. Margaret listened as the doctor described a rare hereditary condition affecting every living member of the Whitmore bloodline. It was a genetic anomaly causing progressive organ failure. It had appeared in her grandfather. It had killed her father at 58. It had taken her brother at 61. And now the same markers were present in her own DNA, in her children's DNA, and in her grandchildren's. The doctor said the condition was unusual. It did not follow normal inheritance patterns. It seemed to have entered the family sometime in the 19th century and had strengthened with each generation rather than weakening. He said he had never seen anything quite like it. Margaret asked if there was a treatment. The doctor paused before answering. He said symptoms could be managed, but what was written in her blood could not be cured. That evening, Margaret sat alone in her study, surrounded by portraits of her ancestors. She looked at the face of Edmund Whitmore, her great-great-grandfather, the man who had built the family fortune on a cotton plantation in South Carolina. She looked at his cold eyes and his stern mouth, and for the first time in her life, she wondered what secrets that face was hiding. She decided to hire a genealogist. She needed to understand where this curse had come from. She needed to know why her family was dying. What she discovered over the next 18 months would reach back 182 years to a small cabin on a plantation called Magnolia, to a 17-year-old girl named Ruth, who had been purchased for a single purpose, and to a revenge so patient and so complete that it had waited almost 2 centuries to be understood. This is that story. The year was 1842. The place was Charleston, South Carolina, one of the wealthiest cities in America. The source of that wealth was cotton, and the source of the cotton was the labor of enslaved people. By 1842, South Carolina had more enslaved people than free citizens. The economy, the culture, and the social order all depended on the continuation of slavery. In the center of Charleston stood a building that tourists today pass without knowing its history. It was called Ryan's Mart, and it was one of the largest slave auction houses in the American South. The building had high ceilings and large windows to let in light. The floors were made of hard brick. The walls were thick enough to muffle the sounds from inside. Every Tuesday and Friday, enslaved people were brought to Ryan's Mart to be sold. They were made to stand on raised platforms while buyers examined them like livestock. Men checked their teeth. Women had their bodies inspected for signs of childbearing. Children were separated from their mothers and sold to different buyers heading to different states. The records from Ryan's Mart still exist today. They are kept in archives at universities and historical societies across the South. And in those records, in the faded ink of an auction year's ledger dated September 14, 1842, there is an entry for a 17-year Old girl listed only as Ruth, female, healthy, suitable for breeding. She was sold for $420 to a man named Edmund Whitmore. Edmund Whitmore was 34 years old in 1842. He owned a plantation called Magnolia, located about 40 miles northwest of Charleston. The plantation covered 200 acres. Most of that land was dedicated to cotton, which was processed in a gin house near the main property and shipped down the Santee River to Charleston for export. Edmund had inherited Magnolia from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. The Whitmores had been in South Carolina since before the Revolution. They considered themselves aristocrats, the natural rulers of the land and everything on it. But Edmund faced a problem that many plantation owners faced in the 1840s. The international slave trade had been banned since 1808. It was now illegal to import enslaved people from Africa or the Caribbean. This meant that the only way to increase the enslaved population was through birth, and birth meant that plantation owners needed women who could produce children. This practice had a name. It was called breeding. Plantation owners selected women specifically for their ability to bear children. These children would either be kept to work on the plantation or sold to other slaveholders for profit. A healthy child could be sold for anywhere from $200 to $500. A woman who produced multiple children could generate thousands of dollars over her lifetime. Edmund Whitmore was a practical man. He understood numbers, and when he saw Ruth standing on that platform in Charleston, he saw an investment. Ruth had been born on a small farm in Virginia in 1825. Her mother, a woman named Abina, had been brought from the Gold Coast of Africa when she was a child. Abina had been sold 3 times before she was 20 and had lost 2 children to sale before Ruth was born. She knew what awaited her daughter. She knew the world they lived in offered no protection and no mercy. But Abina carried something with her from Africa that could not be sold or stolen. She carried knowledge. Her own mother had been a healer in their village, a woman who understood the properties of plants, the secrets of roots and leaves and bark. This knowledge had been passed down through generations of women, and Abina passed it to Ruth. From the time Ruth was old enough to walk, her mother taught her to recognize plants. She learned which leaves could reduce fever. She learned which roots could ease the pain of childbirth. She learned which berries could help a person sleep and which could stop a heart if given in the wrong amount. Abina made Ruth memorize everything. She said that knowledge was the only thing they could never take away. Ruth was 12 years old when her mother was sold to a buyer from Georgia. She never saw Abina again, but she kept everything her mother had taught her locked inside her mind like a treasure that no one could touch. For the next 5 years, Ruth worked on a tobacco farm in Virginia. She was quiet and obedient. She did what she was told. She never spoke back. She never caused trouble, and she never let anyone see what she was really thinking. In September of 1842, the tobacco farm was sold and all the enslaved people were taken to Charleston to be auctioned. Ruth stood on the platform at Ryan's Mart and watched the white faces looking up at her. She watched them discussing her body like she was a horse or a piece of furniture, and she watched Edmund Whitmore raise his hand and buy her. She did not know it then, but she had just met the man whose bloodline she would destroy. Magnolia Plantation sat at the end of a long road lined with oak trees. The main house was a 2-story building with white columns and wide porches. Behind it stood the kitchen house, the smokehouse, the dairy, and the workshops. Further back, past the gardens and the stables, were the slave quarters, a row of small wooden cabins with dirt floors and no windows. Ruth arrived at Magnolia in late September of 1842. She was taken directly to a cabin at the end of the row and told that this would be her home. The cabin had one room, a single bed made of rope and straw, and a fireplace that did not work properly. The roof leaked when it rained, the walls let in the cold, but Ruth was not expected to spend much time in her cabin. Within 2 weeks of her arrival, she was summoned to the main house. Edmund Whitmore's wife, a woman named Constance, was present when Ruth arrived. Constance was a thin woman with pale skin and nervous hands. She did not look at Ruth directly. She kept her eyes on the floor while her husband explained what was expected. Edmund said that Ruth had been purchased for a specific purpose. She was young and healthy. She would bear children. Those children would belong to him to do with as he saw fit. She would be given adequate food and shelter as long as she remained productive. If she caused trouble or failed to conceive, she would be sold further south to the cotton fields of Mississippi or Louisiana, where life expectancy for enslaved people was measured in years, not decades. Ruth stood in silence and listened. She did not cry. She did not beg. She simply nodded and said, "Yes, sir," when he was finished. That night, Edmund Whitmore came to her cabin for the first time. Over the next 7 years, Ruth gave birth to 5 children. The first was a boy born in the summer of 1843. Edmund named him Samuel. The second was a girl born in 1844. She was named Mary. The third was another boy in 1846 named Thomas. The fourth was a girl in 1847 named Sarah. The fifth was a boy in 1849 named Joseph. Ruth nursed each of her children until they were weaned. She held them. She sang to them in the language her mother had taught her, words from a homeland she had never seen but carried in her blood. She loved them with a ferocity that she kept hidden from everyone around her, but she also knew that none of them would stay with her. The children were sold as soon as they were old enough to be useful. Samuel was sold at age 7 to a plantation in Alabama. Mary was sold at age 6 to a household in Savannah. Thomas, Sarah, and Joseph followed in turn. Each time Ruth watched her children being led away in chains, and each time she felt something inside her hardened like stone. Edmund Whitmore kept careful records of these transactions. The records still exist in the Whitmore family papers, which were donated to the South Carolina Historical Society in 1952. They show that Edmund earned a total of $2,800 from the sale of Ruth's children. He considered this an excellent return on his original investment. What the records do not show is what Ruth was thinking during those 7 years. They do not show the plans forming in her mind. They do not show the anger building behind her quiet eyes. But there was another set of records that Edmund did not know about. Ruth was keeping her own account, written not on paper but in memory. And in that account, a debt was growing that would take generations to repay. In the spring of 1850, something changed at Magnolia Plantation. Constance Whitmore, Edmund's wife, had been sick for years. She suffered from what the doctors called female complaints, which was a common way of saying they did not know what was wrong. She spent most of her days in her bedroom taking laudanum for the pain and receiving visits from a series of physicians who prescribed various cures that never worked. But in March of 1850, Constance's condition suddenly improved. The change was remarkable. She began eating again. She started leaving her room. She even walked in the gardens for the first time in 2 years. The cause of this improvement was a tea that Ruth had begun preparing for her. Ruth had approached the house cook, an older woman named Esther, and suggested that she knew a remedy that might help the mistress. Esther was skeptical at first, but she had seen enough of Ruth's quiet competence over the years to trust her. She brought the tea to Constance, who drank it and found that her pain diminished within hours. From that day forward, Ruth prepared a special tea for Constance every morning. She also began preparing tonics for other members of the household. She made a digestive remedy for Edmund's elderly mother, who lived in a cottage on the property. She made a sleep aid for Edmund himself, who complained of restlessness. She made strengthening drinks for the Whitmore children, Edmund's 3 legitimate sons who would inherit the plantation. Everyone in the main house came to rely on Ruth's remedies. They trusted her. They called her Good Ruth and remarked on how lucky they were to have such a skilled woman in their possession. None of them asked what was in the drinks. None of them questioned why Ruth had suddenly become so helpful to the family that had stolen her children. Ruth never told them. She simply smiled, bowed her head, and kept preparing her specialties. The knowledge that Ruth's mother had passed down to her included more than healing remedies. It also included information about plants that could harm, substances that could weaken the body over time without leaving obvious traces. Among the plants that grew wild in the Carolina Low Country was one called pokeweed. In small amounts, pokeweed could be used as a purgative. In larger amounts over extended periods, it could cause lasting damage to the blood and internal organs. Another plant called bloodroot could cause similar effects. There were others too, plants with names that Ruth knew only in her mother's language. Plants that had been used in Africa for purposes that were never written down, but were passed from mother to daughter through generations. Ruth did not use enough of any single substance to cause immediate illness. She was too careful for that. She used amounts so small that they would not be noticed. Combinations so subtle that no doctor would ever identify them. She measured everything by instinct and experience, adjusting her recipes based on the reactions she observed. The effects would not appear right away. They would take years to manifest, and even then they would look like natural illness, like the kind of weakness that runs in families. No one would ever trace them back to the quiet woman who prepared the morning tea, but Ruth knew. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was not trying to kill Edmund Whitmore or his wife or his mother. Killing them would only bring suspicion and punishment. She was doing something far more devastating. She was planting seeds of destruction in their bloodline, alterations that would be passed down from parent to child, weaknesses that would compound with each generation until the Whitmore family simply ceased to exist. Her children had been taken from her and sold like animals. The Whitmore children would never have children of their own, or if they did, those children would be sickly and short-lived. The family that had profited from her suffering would pay with the only thing they truly valued, their legacy. Ruth was patient. She had learned patience in the fields and the auction houses and the cabin where Edmund Whitmore came to her at night. She knew that she would not live to see her revenge completed, but she also knew that some debts take generations to collect, and she was willing to wait. By 1855, the effects of Ruth's work were beginning to show, though no one connected them to her. Edmund Whitmore's eldest son, William, had always been a healthy boy, but in his late teens, he began experiencing fatigue and unexplained bleeding. Doctors were called from Charleston and even from as far as Philadelphia. They examined William and diagnosed him with a blood disorder of unknown origin. They prescribed rest and iron supplements. They said he would likely recover. William did not recover. He died in 1857, 2 months after his 21st birthday. Edmund's second son, Charles, showed similar symptoms beginning in his early 20s. He managed to marry and father 2 children before his health declined. He died in 1863 during the Civil War, though not from any battle wound. He simply collapsed one day and never woke up. The third son, Henry, lived the longest. He survived the war and even managed the plantation during the difficult years of Reconstruction. But he never married and he never had children. He told people he was not interested in family life. But those who knew him well said he was afraid. He had watched his brothers die. He did not want to pass whatever curse they carried to another generation. Henry died in 1889 alone in the house where he had been born. With his death, the direct male line of Edmund Whitmore came to an end. But the family did not disappear entirely. Charles's 2 children, both daughters, had married and carried the Whitmore blood into new families. The genetic damage that Ruth had introduced continued to spread, manifesting in different ways in different generations, but always present, always waiting. Ruth herself lived until 1881. She was 66 years old when she died, which was an unusually long life for someone who had spent her youth in slavery. She witnessed the end of slavery in 1865. She witnessed the brief hope of Reconstruction when black men could vote and hold office and own land. And she witnessed the violent end of that hope as white Southerners reasserted control through terror and legislation. After the war, Ruth left Magnolia Plantation and settled in a small community of freed people near Charleston. She worked as a healer, using the knowledge her mother had given her to help her neighbors. She delivered babies and treated fevers and sat with the dying as they passed. She never married. She never had more children. The 5 children she had born had been scattered across the South, and she spent years trying to find them. She located 2 of them, Samuel and Sarah, who had survived slavery and the war. She saw them again before she died. She held her grandchildren, but she never told anyone what she had done to the Whitmore family. She kept that secret buried deep inside her, a private victory that she carried to her grave, or almost to her grave. A few weeks before she died, Ruth called her granddaughter to her bedside. The granddaughter's name was Patience, and she was 16 years old. Ruth told Patience that there was something she needed to know, a story that had never been told, but that deserved to be remembered. Ruth told her everything. She told her about the cabin at Magnolia. She told her about her children being sold. She told her about the teas and the tonics and the slow revenge she had planted in the Whitmore blood. She told her granddaughter to write it all down so that someday, when the Whitmore family finally understood what had happened to them, someone would know the truth. Patience wrote the story in a small leather notebook. She wrote it in English because that was the only language she knew. But she kept the book hidden because she understood how dangerous such a document could be. If white people found it, if they read what Ruth had done, there was no telling what might happen. Patience kept the notebook her entire life. When she died in 1921, she passed it to her own daughter. The daughter passed it to her daughter in turn. The notebook traveled through generations, always hidden, always protected, always waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The Whitmore family, meanwhile, continued its slow decline. Charles's descendants spread across the South and eventually to the North. They changed their names through marriage. They moved to new cities and started new businesses. They had no idea that they carried Ruth's legacy in their blood. But the effects continued in each generation. There were premature deaths. There were unexplained illnesses. There were couples who tried for years to have children and never succeeded. The pattern was there for anyone who cared to look, but no one looked. The connections between distant cousins were too faint. The family was too scattered, and the original cause was too far in the past. By the 20th century, the Whitmore name had almost faded from history. The plantation called Magnolia had been sold and divided and sold again. The main house had burned down in 1911 and was never rebuilt. The slave cabins had been demolished to make way for tenant farming operations. Only the family papers survived, donated to the Historical Society by a descendant who had no idea what secrets they contained. And Ruth's notebook waited, passed from hand to hand through generations of her descendants, waiting for the day when it would finally be read by someone who would understand. That day came in 2020, when Margaret Whitmore Collins began searching for answers to her family's curse. Margaret had hired a genealogist named David Okonjo to trace her family history. David was a professor of African American history at Howard University who specialized in using genetic databases and historical records to reconnect families that had been separated by slavery. He was exactly the kind of person who might find connections that others had missed. David began his research with the standard sources. He examined census records, property transfers, birth and death certificates, and military records. He traced the Whitmore family back through generations, documenting marriages and births and deaths. He confirmed the pattern that Margaret had described. the unusual concentration of illness and early death that seemed to follow the Whitmore bloodline. But when he reached the 19th century, he found something unexpected. He found records of enslaved people at Magnolia Plantation. He found bills of sale and auction records and plantation inventories, and in those records, he found the name Ruth. David Cross referenced Ruth's information with genetic databases that had been built from DNA samples submitted by people searching for their ancestry. He found matches, he found descendants, and when he contacted those descendants, one of them told him about a notebook that had been passed down through her family for over a century. The notebook was brought to David's office in a cardboard box wrapped in old cloth. It was small, no bigger than a man's hand, with a leather cover that had cracked and faded with age. The pages inside were fragile and yellowed, covered in handwriting that was difficult to read. David spent 3 weeks transcribing the notebook. When he finished, he sat alone in his office for a long time, trying to decide what to do with what he had learned. Then he called Margaret Whitmore Collins and told her that he had found the answer she was looking for. He said she should probably sit down before he continued. Margaret flew to Washington the following week. She met David in his office at Howard University. He handed her a copy of the transcription and watched her face as she read. The notebook began with a simple statement. My grandmother's name was Ruth. She was bought for breeding in 1842. This is what she did. What followed was the story that Ruth had told her granddaughter Patience in 1881. It was the story of the teas and the tonics, the slow poisoning that Ruth had administered over years, the deliberate destruction of the Whitmore bloodline. It explained everything that Margaret's doctors had been unable to understand. At the end of the notebook, written in a different hand that must have been added later, there was a single line. She said they sold her children, so she made sure their children would end. She said some debts take a long time to pay. Margaret read the notebook twice. Then she set it down and looked at David Akonjo. She asked if this was real. She asked if what the notebook described was even possible. David said that he had consulted with medical historians and geneticists. He said that while the specific mechanisms Ruth described were not scientifically precise, the general principle was sound. Certain toxic substances, particularly heavy metals and plant alkaloids, could cause genetic damage that persisted across generations. This was called epigenetic modification, and it was a real phenomenon that scientists were only beginning to understand. He said that Ruth may not have understood the science of what she was doing, but she understood the practice. Her mother had taught her techniques that had been developed over generations in Africa. Techniques for influencing health and reproduction that European medicine would not discover for another century and a half. David paused, then he said there was one more thing Margaret should know. He said that Ruth's descendants had been traced through the genetic databases. There were living members of Ruth's family, people who carried her blood just as Margaret carried the blood of Edmund Whitmore. And one of those descendants had agreed to meet with Margaret if she wanted. Margaret said yes, she wanted to meet them. The meeting took place 2 weeks later in Charleston, South Carolina, in a hotel conference room overlooking the harbor where slave ships had once unloaded their cargo. Margaret arrived first. She sat at the table and waited, her hands folded in front of her. She had spent the past 2 weeks thinking about what she would say. She had rehearsed speeches about reconciliation and understanding. She had prepared herself to apologize for what her ancestors had done. But when the door opened and Ruth's descendant walked in, all of Margaret's prepared words disappeared. The woman's name was Grace Williams. She was 71 years old, 4 years older than Margaret. She had gray hair and dark skin and eyes that seemed to look straight through everything they saw. She was a retired school teacher from Atlanta who had spent her career teaching Black history to children who had never been told the truth about their past. Grace sat down across from Margaret. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Grace reached into her bag and pulled out the original notebook, the one that Patience had written in 1881. She placed it on the table between them. She said that her family had kept this notebook for almost 140 years. She said they had always known what it contained, but they had never known what to do with it. Some of her relatives had wanted to destroy it. Some had wanted to publish it. Most had simply wanted to keep it hidden and let the past stay buried. But Grace had made a different decision. She had decided that the truth needed to be told, not for revenge, but for understanding. She said that Ruth's story was part of American history, a piece of the past that had been deliberately erased and forgotten. She said that bringing it to light was a way of honoring Ruth's memory and the memory of all the women like her who had suffered and resisted and survived. Grace pushed the notebook across the table toward Margaret. She said that she wanted Margaret to have it. She said it belonged to both of their families now. She said that Ruth's revenge was complete and holding on to anger would not change what had already happened. Margaret picked up the notebook. She held it carefully, feeling the weight of 2 centuries in her hands. She asked Grace if she was angry. She asked if she blamed her, Margaret, for what Edmund Whitmore had done. Grace thought about the question for a long time before answering. She said that anger was a fire that burned the person who carried it. She said that Ruth had carried her anger for 40 years, and it had consumed her life just as surely as it had consumed the Whitmores. She said that both families had been prisoners of the same history, trapped by choices made before any of them were born. But she also said that understanding was not the same as forgiveness. She said that what Edmund Whitmore had done, what the whole system of slavery had done, was unforgivable. It could not be erased or made right by any act of reconciliation. The only thing they could do was acknowledge it, learn from it, and make sure it was never forgotten. Margaret nodded. She understood. She asked Grace what happened to Ruth's children, the 5 who had been sold away from her. She asked if Grace knew where they had ended up. Grace said that she knew about 2 of them, Samuel and Sarah, who had reconnected with Ruth after the war. Their descendants were part of Grace's family, but the other 3, Mary, Thomas, and Joseph, had been lost. Their trail ended at the auction houses where they had been sold. There were no records of where they went or what happened to them. Grace said that this was the true legacy of slavery. It was not just the suffering of those who were enslaved. It was the destruction of families, the severing of connections that could never be repaired. Millions of people had been scattered across the continent, and their descendants were still searching for each other today. Margaret looked down at the notebook in her hands. She thought about her own family, the doctors and the genetic tests, and the fear of what would happen to her grandchildren. She thought about Ruth, a 17-year-old girl standing on an auction platform watching her future being decided by strangers. She asked Grace one final question. She asked what Ruth would have wanted if she could see them sitting here together. Grace smiled for the first time since she had entered the room. She said that Ruth would have wanted to be remembered. She would have wanted people to know her name and her story. She would have wanted the world to understand that enslaved people were not passive victims. They resisted, they fought back in whatever ways they could, and sometimes their resistance outlasted the people who had tried to destroy them. Margaret closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she had made a decision. She said that she would make sure Ruth's story was told. She would donate the notebook to a museum. She would fund research into the Whitmore plantation records. She would do everything in her power to ensure that Ruth's name would not be forgotten. Grace reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. She held it for a moment. 2 old women connected by a history they had not chosen, but could not escape. Then Grace stood up, gathered her things, and walked out of the room without looking back. Margaret sat alone for a long time, holding the notebook and watching the sunset over Charleston Harbor. The story of Ruth and the Whitmore family did not end in that Charleston hotel room. In many ways, it was only beginning to be understood. After her meeting with Grace Williams, Margaret Whitmore Collins returned to Boston and began the work she had promised to do. She contacted historians, archivists, and museum curators. She opened the Whitmore family papers to researchers for the first time. She funded a project to digitize plantation records from across the South Carolina Low Country, making them available to anyone searching for ancestors who had been enslaved. But Margaret also began a more personal investigation. She wanted to understand not just what Ruth had done, but how she had done it. She wanted to know how a 17-year-old girl with no formal education had possessed knowledge sophisticated enough to alter the genetic destiny of an entire family. The answer to that question would take her far beyond the borders of South Carolina, back across the Atlantic Ocean to the coast of West Africa, to a tradition of knowledge that had survived the Middle Passage and continued to influence American history in ways that most people never recognized. Ruth's mother, Abina, had been born around 1800 in a region that is now part of modern Ghana. She came from a community where women held specific roles as healers and herbalists. This was not unusual in West African societies. In many cultures along the Gold Coast, medical knowledge was passed from mother to daughter through generations of careful teaching. The women who held this knowledge were not simply folk healers mixing random plants. They were trained practitioners who understood the properties of hundreds of different substances. They knew which plants could cure and which could kill. They knew how to prepare medicines that would act immediately and others that would work slowly over time. They knew how to combine ingredients to produce effects that no single substance could achieve alone. When Abina was captured and sold into slavery around 1810, she carried this knowledge with her. It was invisible to the slave traders who examined her body for signs of health and strength. It was invisible to the plantation owners who purchased her. But it was the most valuable thing she possessed, more valuable than any physical skill or labor she could provide. Abina taught everything she knew to her daughter Ruth. She began the lessons when Ruth was barely old enough to walk, pointing out plants in the fields and forests, explaining their properties in whispered conversations at night. She made Ruth memorize hundreds of combinations and preparations. She tested her daughter constantly, asking her to identify plants by sight and smell, quizzing her on dosages and methods. By the time Ruth was 12 years old, when Abina was sold away and the two were separated forever, Ruth had absorbed a lifetime of medical knowledge. She knew more about the human body and its responses to different substances than most trained physicians in America, and she knew how to use that knowledge as a weapon. The specific methods Ruth employed at Magnolia Plantation were reconstructed by researchers who studied her notebook and compared it to historical records of African medicinal practices. Ruth's primary tool was a combination of plant-based compounds that would now be classified as mutagens, substances capable of causing changes to DNA. The most significant of these was a preparation derived from pokeweed, a plant native to the eastern United States, but similar to species used in West African medicine. Pokeweed contains chemicals called mitogens that affect how cells divide and reproduce. In small doses, these chemicals can stimulate the immune system. In larger doses over extended periods, they can cause cumulative damage to cellular reproduction, damage that is passed from parent to child through what scientists now call epigenetic modification. Ruth combined pokeweed with other substances, including preparations made from bloodroot and certain fungi that grew in the damp corners of the plantation buildings. She adjusted her mixtures based on the responses she observed, increasing or decreasing concentrations to achieve the effects she wanted while avoiding detection. The genius of Ruth's approach was its gradualism. She never administered enough of any substance to cause immediate illness. Instead, she created a slow accumulation of damage that would only become apparent years or decades later. By the time the Whitmore family began to sicken and die, Ruth was long beyond suspicion. She was simply the quiet woman who made the morning tea. Medical historians who reviewed the Whitmore family records found patterns consistent with Ruth's methods. The deaths in the family showed signatures of cumulative toxic exposure combined with inherited genetic damage. The specific combination of symptoms, including bleeding disorders, organ failure, and reproductive problems, matched what would be expected from the substances Ruth described in her notebook. One researcher, a geneticist at Duke University named Dr. Sarah Mensah, spent 3 years studying the case. She concluded that Ruth had essentially invented a form of genetic warfare more than a century before the science existed to explain it. Ruth may not have understood the mechanisms of DNA or inheritance, but she understood the practical effects of her actions. She knew that damage to the parents would be reflected in the children, and she used that knowledge with devastating precision. Dr. Mensah published her findings in a medical journal in 2022. The article attracted significant attention, both for its scientific implications and for its historical significance. It demonstrated that enslaved Africans had brought sophisticated medical knowledge to America, knowledge that had been dismissed and forgotten by a society that refused to recognize their humanity or their intelligence. But Ruth's story was not only a story of revenge, it was also a story of survival, resistance, and the unbreakable bonds between mother and child. After her meeting with Grace Williams, Margaret Whitmore Collins became obsessed with finding Ruth's lost children. She hired investigators and genealogists. She searched through auction records and slave manifests. She submitted DNA samples to every database that would accept them. The search took 4 years. Most of it led nowhere. The records from the antebellum South were incomplete and often deliberately destroyed. Many enslaved people had been listed only by first name, making them impossible to trace. Others had been sold multiple times, their trails disappearing into the chaos of the interstate slave trade. But in 2024, Margaret's team finally found a lead. Among the records at Ryan's Mart in Charleston, they discovered a ledger from 1849 that showed the sale of a 6-year-old boy named Joseph to a plantation in Mississippi. The buyer's name was listed as Cornelius Drake. The price was $275. The Drake plantation had been located near Natchez, Mississippi, one of the wealthiest districts in the antebellum South. Unlike many plantations, the Drake family had kept detailed records of their enslaved workers, including births, deaths, and family relationships. These records had been preserved by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Margaret's researchers found Joseph in the Drake records. He had arrived at the plantation in the fall of 1849 and had been assigned to work in the cotton fields. He had survived childhood, which many enslaved children did not. He had grown to adulthood and had married a woman named Dina in 1865, just months after the end of the Civil War. Joseph and Dina had 7 children together, their descendants numbered in the hundreds. And through the genetic databases that had become common in the 21st century, those descendants could be traced and contacted. Margaret located Joseph's living descendants, scattered across the country from Mississippi to California to New York. She contacted them one by one, explaining who she was and what she had discovered. Most of them had never heard of Ruth or Magnolia Plantation. They knew only that their ancestors had been enslaved somewhere in the South. When Margaret told them Ruth's story, when she explained that they were the descendants of a woman who had struck back against her oppressors in a way that had never been documented in any history book, the reactions were varied. Some were proud, some were shocked, some were angry that it had taken so long for the truth to come out. But all of them wanted to know more. The discovery of Joseph's descendants led to an even more remarkable finding. Among Joseph's great-grandchildren was a woman named Rosalind Carter, a retired nurse living in Oakland, California. Rosalind was 73 years old when Margaret contacted her. She had spent her career working in community health clinics, serving populations that the mainstream medical system often ignored. When Rosalind heard Ruth's story, she began to cry. She said that everything suddenly made sense. Rosalind explained that her grandmother, Joseph's granddaughter, had been a healer in their community in rural Mississippi. She had known plants and remedies that nobody else understood. She had delivered babies and treated illnesses and helped people die with dignity. And she had always said that her knowledge came from her grandmother, who had learned it from her mother, who had learned it from Africa. The knowledge that Abina had passed to Ruth had not died with Ruth. It had survived through Joseph, through his children and grandchildren, through generations of women who had preserved and practiced what they had inherited. The tradition that had given Ruth the power to destroy the Whitmore bloodline had also given her descendants the power to heal. Rosalind still had notebooks that her grandmother had kept, filled with recipes